In the grand, haunted theater of history, some dynasties are remembered for the empires they built, others for the faith they championed. But there are a few, a rare and tragic few, who are remembered for their blood. Not for the blood they spilled on the battlefield, but for the blood that coursed through their own veins, a substance they sought to preserve, to purify, to hoard, until the very act of preservation became a slow, inexorable poison. This is the story of such a house, a dynasty that rose from the ultimate betrayal, the murder of a brother, and then turned its gaze inward, seeking to secure its fragile legitimacy by weaving a tangled, suffocating web of marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces. This is the story of the House of Trastamara. It is the tale of how a family's obsession with its own bloodline laid the foundation for the most infamous genetic tragedy in European history. The Habsburg jaw, the Habsburg curse, the slow, agonizing decay of a world-spanning empire. Before the Habsburgs, there were the Trastamaras. They were the architects of a unified Spain, the patrons of a new world, but they were also the authors of their own ruin, a cautionary tale of how the desire for purity can breed only madness. And their story begins as it was destined to end in a struggle over legitimacy, with a crown seized by a bastard's hand. Imagine Castile in the middle of the 14th century. It is not yet Spain. It is a kingdom of dust and light, a harsh, unforgiving landscape where the centuries-long war to reconquer the peninsula from its Muslim rulers has forged a warrior aristocracy, proud, violent, and fiercely independent. Upon its throne sat King Peter I, a man history would call the cruel. Peter was a king of formidable, inflexible will, a man who envisioned a modern centralized state where the king's law was absolute. To achieve this, he waged war on the privileges of his own nobility and placed his trust in a class of educated administrators, many of whom were from Spain's prosperous Jewish communities. To the nobles, this was a double insult, an assault on their power and a betrayal of their faith. They saw a tyrant who favored the infidel over his own Christian knights. They needed a champion to restore the old ways. They found him in the king's own family, in his illegitimate half-brother Henry, Count of Trastamara. Henry was the eldest and most favored of the bastard sons of the previous king, Alfonso XI, and his beloved mistress, Eleanor de Guzman. While Peter, the legitimate heir, grew up in the cold shadow of a neglected queen, Henry and his brothers were raised in the sunlit center of the court. When their father died and Peter ascended the throne, a brutal reckoning began. Henry's mother was executed, his brothers hunted down. Henry alone escaped, fleeing to France with a heart full of vengeance. But to challenge a king, one needs more than a personal grievance. One needs a cause, a justification that can turn rebellion into a righteous war. And so Henry and his allies concocted a story of breathtaking cynicism, a whisper campaign that claimed King Peter was not the true son of Alfonso IX at all, but a Jewish changeling, swapped at birth. It was a lie, but a powerful one. It weaponized the latent anti-Semitism of the age and reframed the dynastic struggle. Suddenly, Henry the bastard could paint himself as the defender of the true Castilian bloodline, while Peter, the legitimate king, was cast as a foreign pollutant on the throne. The first battle of the Trastamara dynasty was thus fought over the very nature of blood and legitimacy, a theme that would haunt them to their final days. The ensuing civil war was a brutal international affair, a proxy conflict in the much larger 100 Years' War between England and France. Henry was backed by French mercenaries, Peter by the legendary English warrior Edward the Black Prince. After years of shifting fortunes, the conflict reached its grim conclusion on a dark night in March of 1369. Lured into a trap with the promise of safe passage, King Peter came face to face with his half-brother in a mercenary's tent. In the struggle that followed, Henry, with the help of an accomplice, overpowered his brother, drew a dagger, and stabbed the king to death. Henry of Trastamara was now King Henry II of Castile. He had won the crown, but he had won it as a bastard and a fratricide. His claim was written in blood, not in law. This original sin, this deep-seated insecurity about the legitimacy of his own bloodline, would become the defining obsession of his new dynasty. How does a house founded on such a crime secure its future? How does it wash its blood clean? Henry's immediate solution was political. He became known as El de las Mercedes, Henry of the Gifts, because he was forced to buy the loyalty of the great nobles by granting them unprecedented power, titles, and lands. He created a new, superpowered aristocracy, effectively dismantling the centralized state his brother had tried to build. He was securing his own reign by weakening the crown for generations to come. But the more profound solution, the one that would become the Trastamara's fatal inheritance, was dynastic. The challenge to their legitimacy did not die with Peter. The dead king had daughters, and their bloodline, in the eyes of many, was purer than Henry's. The most powerful prince in England, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, married Peter's eldest daughter, Constance, and declared himself the rightful king of Castile. For years, this English claim hung over the Trastamaras like a sword. The dynasty that had been founded on a lie about impure blood was now haunted by a legitimate rival bloodline. The solution, devised by Henry's son and successor, John I, was a stroke of political genius that would set a fateful precedent. After years of inconclusive warfare, a peace was made. In the Treaty of Bayonne of 1388, John of Gaunt agreed to renounce his claim. The price was not just gold, but blood. John I's son, the future Henry III, was to marry John of Gaunt's daughter, Catherine of Lancaster. She was the granddaughter of the murdered King Peter. The blood of the killer would merge with the blood of the victim. On the surface, it was a brilliant act of reconciliation, but it taught the Trastamaras a crucial, dangerous lesson. The best way to eliminate a rival bloodline was not to defeat it, but to absorb it. The best way to purify a tainted claim was to marry it. This strategy, born of external political necessity, would soon be turned inward. If marrying your cousin, the daughter of your English rival, could secure the throne, then why not apply the same logic to the family itself? The opportunity arose from the dynasty's own success. In 1412, a junior branch of the family, led by the capable and ambitious Ferdinand of Antequera, secured the throne of the neighboring kingdom of Aragon through a shrewd political process known as the Compromise of Caspe. This was a moment of immense triumph. The bastard house now ruled both of the great kingdoms of Christian Spain, but it also created a new and complex dynamic. The Trastamaras were now divided into two powerful royal houses, the senior line in Castile and the junior line in Aragon. They were cousins, but they were also rivals. The Aragonese Trastamaras, descended from the heroic Ferdinand, often looked with disdain upon their Castilian cousins, whom they saw as weak and ineffectual. And so the stage was set. The most powerful, most convenient, and most logical marriage alliances for the Trastamaras of Castile were now with their own cousins, the Trastamaras of Aragon. Such unions served a dual purpose. They kept the vast wealth and power of the two kingdoms within the family, preventing foreign houses from gaining a foothold, and they reinforce the dynasty's sense of its own exclusive royal blood. Each marriage between a Castilian Trastamara and an Aragonese Trastamara was a statement. Our blood is so precious, so important, that it can only be mingled with itself. This turn inward began almost immediately. John II of Castile, a man more interested in poetry and tournaments than in governance, was married to his first cousin, Maria of Aragon. His son and heir, the future Henry IV, would in turn be married to another cousin, Blanche of Navarre, whose mother was an Aragonese Trastamara. The family tree was beginning to curl back on itself. The lines of descent were becoming loops. What had begun as a political strategy was becoming a biological imperative, a closed system. This was not in itself unusual for the royal houses of Europe, who all practiced a degree of endogamy. But with the Trastamaras, it was coupled with their unique foundational insecurity. Their constant need to prove their legitimacy, to wash away the stain of Henry II's sin, created a powerful psychological drive towards this kind of dynastic introversion. Furthermore, the rise of the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood in Spanish society at large, added a dangerous ideological justification. This concept, initially aimed at questioning the sincerity of Jewish converts to Christianity, created a social obsession with untainted ancestry. For the royal family, the ultimate expression of pure blood was to marry within their own sanctified lineage. They were, in a sense, applying the toxic racial logic of their society to their own family tree. They could not have known the price. In the 15th century, the laws of heredity were a mystery, understood only through the vague, observable evidence of animal husbandry. They could see that certain traits were passed down, but the mechanisms were unknown, attributed to the will of God or the humors of the body. They could not have understood that by sealing their bloodline off from the outside world, they were not just concentrating its perceived strengths, but also its hidden weaknesses. They were creating a genetic echo chamber where any latent flaw, any recessive frailty, any predisposition to physical or mental illness would be amplified with each successive generation. The long and chaotic reign of John II gave the first hints of the coming dysfunction. His weakness and passivity created a power vacuum that was filled by his brilliant and overbearing favorite, Álvaro de Luna. The king's court was paralyzed for decades by the struggle between Luna and the king's own Aragonese cousins, the Infante of Aragon, who treated Castile like their personal playground. The family was at war with itself, a political conflict that mirrored the biological entanglement that was taking place in the royal bedchambers. The kingdom was sick, and its sickness stemmed from the very heart of the royal house. When John II's disastrous reign finally ended, he was succeeded by his son Henry IV, a man in whom the Trastamara fragility began to manifest in deeply troubling ways. Known to history as the impotent, his disastrous, unconsummated first marriage to his cousin Blanche of Navarre became a public scandal. His desperate second marriage produced a daughter, Juana, whose paternity was so widely doubted that she was universally known by the mocking nickname La Beltraneja, implying she was the daughter not of the king, but of his favorite, Beltran de la Cueva. The crisis of Henry IV's reign was the direct result of the dynasty's flawed strategy. A house so obsessed with the legitimacy of its bloodline now found itself with a king who was seemingly unable to produce a legitimate heir. The entire political structure, built on the principle of hereditary succession, was thrown into chaos. This chaos plunged the kingdom into another devastating civil war, a conflict that pitted the king against his own half-siblings. the young Alfonso and his sister, a quiet, ferociously determined teenager named Isabella. This war was the crucible that would forge the future of Spain, but it was a crisis born entirely from within the family, a consequence of a century of looking inward. The Trastámaras had sought to secure their bloodline by making it a closed circle. The result was a king whose potency was questioned, a disputed succession, and a kingdom tearing itself apart. They had sown the wind of dynastic pride, and they were now reaping the whirlwind of genetic and political chaos. The early death of her brother Alfonso left Isabella as the sole challenger to the throne, and in her, the Trastámara ambition burned with a new and powerful intensity, tempered by a shrewd political intelligence and a fervent, almost mystical sense of her own destiny. She too would look to a marriage to secure her claim, and she too would look within the family. Her chosen husband was her own second cousin, Ferdinand, the dynamic young heir to the Trastámara throne of Aragon. Their secret marriage in 1469 was an act of profound defiance, but it was also the ultimate expression of the Trastámara strategy. It was the final, definitive merging of the two great branches of the house. It was a union designed to end the century of infighting and create a single, unassailable Spanish monarchy. It was the culmination of the dynasty's long, troubled journey. It would bring them unprecedented power, launch an age of global empire, and complete the unification of Spain. But it would also cement the fatal pattern of inbreeding. At the very apex of the dynasty, their children would be the products of this deeply intertwined lineage, and through the marriage of one of those children, their haunted, tragic daughter, Juana, to a Habsburg prince, this concentrated, compromised, and ultimately cursed bloodline would be passed on. The legacy of the Trastámaras, their ambition, their piety, their violence, and the hidden frailties within their blood would be bequeathed to the House of Habsburg, setting the stage for a new act in the long, sorrowful drama of royal heredity. The seeds of the future were all there, planted a century before in a bloody tent at Montiel, and nurtured in the gilded, claustrophobic confines of the royal bedchamber. The death of a king who leaves a disputed succession is like a crack appearing in the ice of a frozen lake. At first it is almost invisible, a faint line in the surface. But with every tremor, every shift in the balance of power, the crack widens, branches out, until the entire structure groans under the strain, ready to shatter. When Henry IV the Impotent drew his last breath in the winter of 1474, he left behind just such a crack in the heart of Castile. He left two potential queens. One was his daughter, Juana la Beltraneja, whose very blood was a subject of scornful debate. The other was his half-sister, Isabella, a woman of iron will, whose marriage to her cousin, Ferdinand of Aragon, was both the ultimate fulfillment of the Trastámara dynastic strategy and an act of open rebellion. The kingdom held its breath. The long, agonizing century of Trastámara, infighting of brother against brother and cousin against cousin, had reached its final decisive chapter. This time, it would be a war between two women for the soul and the bloodline of Castile. Isabella, from the moment the news of her brother's death reached her, demonstrated the quality that would define her reign, an absolute refusal to wait for destiny to be handed to her. She understood that legitimacy, especially a claim as contested as hers, is not a matter of law, but of perception and performance. Power belongs to those who seize it. While her rivals debated and dithered, she acted. 2 days after Henry's death, she rode into the main square of Segovia. It was a calculated piece of political theater. She was dressed not in mourning, but in the white and gold of a sovereign. She did not ask for the crown. She took it, proclaimed queen proprietor of Castile, with her husband Ferdinand as her king consort. It was a stunning declaration. The era of weak, vacillating kings was over, but a coronation is merely a claim, and a claim must be defended. The great noble houses that had thrived in the chaos of her brother's reign, powerful, rapacious men who feared the firm hand of Isabella and Ferdinand, rallied to the cause of the young Juana. They saw in her a more pliable ruler, a return to the comfortable anarchy they so cherished, and they sought a foreign champion to give their cause military weight. They found one in Juana's uncle, the formidable King Afonso V of Portugal. For Afonso, this was a chance to achieve the century-old dream of his own dynasty, to absorb Castile and unite the peninsula under a Portuguese crown. He announced his betrothal to his own niece, a union that even by the standards of the day was deeply cynical. And in the spring of 1475, the Portuguese army crossed the frontier. The War of the Castilian Succession began. This was the final Trastamara civil war, and it was a conflict fought explicitly over the question of blood. Was the true bloodline represented by Juana, the daughter of the last king, however disputed her paternity? Or was it represented by Isabella, the daughter of John II, whose own claim rested on the disinheritance of her niece? For Isabella and Ferdinand, it was a war to prove that their union, the ultimate intra-Trastamara alliance, was not just a political merger, but the divinely ordained purification of the royal house. They were fighting to establish their blood as the only legitimate blood. The war was a brutal, grinding affair that tore the kingdom apart. But the supporters of Juana had fundamentally misjudged the woman they were fighting. Isabella was a force of nature, while Ferdinand, a skilled and courageous general, commanded their armies. Isabella became the logistical and spiritual heart of their cause. She was a whirlwind of motion, a queen who governed from the saddle. She rode across the kingdom, often deep into her pregnancies, her presence alone shoring up the morale of wavering towns. She personally negotiated with powerful nobles. Her unique combination of intense piety and pragmatic resolve winning many to her side. She was relentless, organizing finances, securing supplies, and demonstrating to the world that she possessed the one quality her recent predecessors had so fatally lacked, the undeniable capacity to rule. The decisive moment came in March of 1476 at the Battle of Toro. The clash itself was a confused and bloody stalemate, but its aftermath was a resounding victory for Isabella. The Portuguese king Afonso lost his nerve. He had expected a quick victory, a kingdom that would welcome him as a liberator. Instead, he had met a nation galvanized into resistance by a queen of terrifying determination. He retreated to Portugal, his invasion broken, leaving his Castilian allies to their fate. The war would sputter on for 3 more years, but the question of who would rule was effectively settled. The final peace, the Treaty of Alcáçovas, was signed in 1479. It was a total victory for Isabella, and it contained a clause that was the ultimate expression of the Trastamara method of dealing with rival bloodlines. Juana la Beltraneja, the girl who had been the cause of the war, was to be permanently neutralized. She was given a choice. She could wait in a convent until Isabella's infant son came of age and then marry him, a final humiliating absorption into the victorious bloodline, or she could take the veil and renounce the world forever. She chose the convent. The rival claim was not just defeated, it was imprisoned, silenced, and erased from the line of succession. It was a fate that would tragically echo a generation later in the life of Isabella's own daughter. With their claim now undisputed, Isabella and Ferdinand, who in that same year became King of Aragon upon his father's death, could begin their true work. They were now the joint sovereigns of a united Spanish monarchy, a personal union of the two great Trastamara crowns. They inherited a land that was a ruin, a playground for robber barons and feuding nobles. Their task was to forge a nation from this chaos, and their methods would be a direct reaction to the failures of their ancestors. They would build their new Spain on two pillars: absolute royal power and absolute religious uniformity. First, they systematically dismantled the power of the Mercedes nobility, the overmighty families that their own ancestor, Henry II, had created to secure his throne. They used their new authority to reclaim royal lands, to demolish illegal castles, and to bring the great military orders with their vast wealth under the direct control of the crown. They created a new state apparatus run not by aristocrats, but by educated lawyers loyal only to them. They were finishing the work Peter the Cruel had started a century before, creating a modern, centralized state. But their vision of unity was more profound and more terrifying than mere political control. For Isabella and Ferdinand, a unified Spain meant a Catholic Spain, a single kingdom under a single God. This vision put them in direct conflict with the complex, multicultural reality of their own society. For centuries, Spain had been home to one of the largest and most prosperous Jewish communities in the world. The pogroms of 1391 had created a new, deeply problematic social class. The conversos, or new Christians, hundreds of thousands of Jews who had converted, often under extreme duress. These conversos were now, in the eyes of the church, Christians, but in the eyes of their old Christian neighbors, they were suspect. Their success in commerce and government bred a toxic envy, and their sincerity was constantly questioned. This suspicion provided the theological justification for the most infamous institution of their reign. In 1478, they requested and received permission from the Pope to establish their own state-controlled Inquisition. Its stated purpose was to root out heresy among Christians. Its real, unspoken target was the converso population. The Spanish Inquisition was a terrifyingly efficient machine of ideological purification. It operated on the same logic that had driven the Trastamara dynasty for a century, an obsession with the purity of blood. The Inquisition did not just ask, "What do you believe?" It asked, "Who are you? What is your lineage? Is your blood clean?" The concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, which had once been a tool of royal propaganda, now became an instrument of state terror. The Inquisition's tribunals, its use of anonymous informants, its secret prisons, and horrific tortures were all designed to expose the taint of Jewish ancestry in those who had become Christian. It was the Trastamara origin story, the lie about a Jewish changeling on the throne, metastasizing into a national nightmare. With the kingdom being politically and religiously purified from within, the monarchs turned their attention outward to the last piece of the puzzle, the Muslim Emirate of Granada in the south. The Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of Spain, became their great unifying project. In 1482, they launched the final war. It was a crusade that mobilized the entire nation, channeling the violent energies of the newly tamed nobility towards a common holy enemy. For 10 years, they waged a relentless war of sieges, using modern artillery to pulverize fortresses that had stood for centuries. Finally, on January 2nd, 1492, the end came. Boabdil, the last Nasrid Sultan, surrendered the keys to the city of Granada and the magnificent Alhambra Palace. The last bastion of Muslim rule in Western Europe had fallen. The Reconquista was complete. It was the crowning achievement of their reign, a moment of almost mystical triumph. That year, 1492, would become their Annus Mirabilis, their year of wonders. But the triumph was immediately followed by two acts that revealed the dark, uncompromising heart of their new Spain. First, they signed the Alhambra Decree, ordering all remaining practicing Jews to either convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom within 4 months. It was a final brutal act of religious cleansing, an economic and cultural catastrophe that saw tens of thousands of their most productive subjects forced into exile. The purification of the bloodline, once a dynastic obsession, was now national policy. The second act of that year was a leap into the unknown. In the flush of victory, Isabella agreed to finance the improbable voyage of a Genoese sailor, Christopher Columbus, who promised to find a new route to the Indies by sailing west. It was a small gamble that would have world-altering consequences. Columbus's discovery of the Americas would transform the newly unified Trastamara kingdom into a global empire, unleashing a river of gold and silver that would fund the ambitions of their heirs for a century. They had achieved everything. They had united Spain, conquered Granada, launched an empire, and forged a new, powerful, and intolerant national identity. They now turned to securing this legacy through their children, using them as pieces in a grand game of European dynastic chess. Their goal was to encircle their great rival France by marrying their 5 children into the royal houses of Portugal, England, and, most importantly, the Holy Roman Empire. This was the Trastamara strategy of absorption and purification, now practiced on a continental scale. And this is where the seeds of the future, the glorious and the tragic, were sown. The most critical of these alliances was the double marriage they arranged with the House of Habsburg, the family of the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I. Their only son and heir, Prince John, was married to Maximilian's daughter, Margaret of Austria, and their second daughter, Juana, was married to Maximilian's handsome, charismatic son and heir, Philip the Handsome. This was the moment, this was the genetic nexus point where the Trastamara legacy would be passed on. The blood of Isabella and Ferdinand was itself the product of generations of cousin marriages. It was a concentrated, potent, and deeply compromised inheritance. Now in Juana, this inheritance was to be fused with the blood of the Habsburgs, another family with a long tradition of marrying its own relatives to preserve its vast scattered domains. The Trastamara obsession with its own blood was about to merge with the Habsburg obsession with its own lands. The result would be a new dynasty, possessed of a global empire and a catastrophic genetic flaw. Juana, the vessel for this momentous transaction, was a young woman who embodied all the contradictions of her lineage. She was intelligent and passionate, but with an emotional fragility, a predisposition to melancholy and obsession that seemed to be the dark underside of the Trastamara blood. She was sent from the stern, pious, and rigid court of Spain to the decadent, pleasure-loving court of Burgundy. And there, she fell into a desperate, all-consuming love for her husband, a love that would become her torment and her undoing. The stage was now set for the final act of the Trastamara story, a personal tragedy that would play out on a global stage, a tragedy of madness and inheritance that would see the great Spanish Empire they had built and the flawed blood that ran in their veins pass into the hands of a new house, the house that would inherit their power and their curse. Victory in a civil war does not cleanse a kingdom. It merely cauterizes the wound. With Juana la Beltraneja imprisoned in a Portuguese convent, a living ghost of a defeated claim, Isabella and Ferdinand stood as the undisputed sovereigns of a united Spanish monarchy. They had won the war for the crown. Now began the far more arduous war for the state. They had inherited not a kingdom, but a collection of feuding fiefdoms, a land bled dry by a century of aristocratic anarchy, a legacy of the weakness their own ancestors had fostered. Their joint reign would become a relentless 30-year campaign to reverse this decay, to forge a new, powerful, and terrifyingly unified Spain from the ruins of the old Trastamara chaos. And they would build it upon the twin pillars that had brought them to power, an absolute belief in their own authority and an absolute belief in the purifying power of a single monolithic faith. Their first target was the source of the rot, the great noble houses. These were the descendants of the men their own great-grandfather, Henry II, had enriched with the Mercedes Enriquenas to secure his bloody throne. For generations, these families, the Mendozas, the Zunigas, the Pimentels, had acted as kings in their own domains, waging private wars, defying royal justice, and treating the crown with contempt. Isabella and Ferdinand understood that to build a nation, they first had to tame these magnificent beasts. They did not seek to destroy them, for they needed their swords and their leadership. Instead, they domesticated them. With the immense prestige of their victory, they began to systematically reclaim the powers the crown had lost. They established a new royal council, deliberately excluding the great territorial magnates and filling it instead with letrados, university-trained lawyers of lesser birth, men whose careers and fortunes depended entirely on the favor of the monarchs, not on their ancient lineage. This new bureaucracy became the engine of the state, loyal only to the crown. They then turned to the lawless countryside. They revitalized and nationalized the Santa Hermandad, the Holy Brotherhood, transforming it from a collection of local militias into a fearsome centralized royal police force. Its mounted patrols dispensed swift and brutal justice, hunting down bandits and suppressing noble feuds. The roads of Castile, for the first time in a century, became safe to travel. The message was clear. There was only one law in the kingdom now, and it flowed from the throne. But their project of unification went far deeper than political reform. It was a spiritual crusade. For Isabella in particular, the political and the religious were inseparable. The chaos and division of her brother's reign were not just a political failure, but a moral and spiritual one. A unified Spain, in her eyes, must be a spiritually pure Spain. And spiritual purity meant Catholic purity. This conviction would lead them to confront the most complex and deeply rooted feature of their society, its centuries-old religious diversity. For all the talk of the Reconquista, medieval Spain had been a land of three faiths. Muslim and Jewish communities had lived alongside Christians for generations, creating a unique, if often tense, cultural symbiosis. But by the late 15th century, this fragile coexistence was breaking down. The violent pogroms of 1391 had created the vast and problematic class of conversos, or new Christians, Jews who had converted, often at sword point. These conversos were a source of deep anxiety for the old Christian population. They were successful, often dominating commerce, finance, and the professions. But were they true Christians? Or were they heretics, secretly practicing the rites of their ancestors in the privacy of their homes, mocking the very faith they professed to have embraced? This suspicion, a toxic brew of religious bigotry and economic envy provided the perfect justification for the most infamous and enduring institution of their reign. In 1478, they petitioned the Pope and were granted the right to establish their own state-controlled Spanish Inquisition. Its purpose was not to persecute Jews who were outside its jurisdiction, but to police the souls of Christians, and its primary obsessive target was the converso population. The Inquisition was the ultimate expression of the Trastamara dynasty's foundational obsession with blood. The very lie that Henry II had used to seize the throne, the slander that his brother was a Jewish changeling, had now been institutionalized, transformed from a piece of political propaganda into a terrifying apparatus of state power. The Inquisition's goal was to purify the blood of the nation, just as Isabella and Ferdinand believed they had purified the blood of the royal house. Under the grim and fanatical direction of its first Inquisitor General, the Dominican friar Tomás de Torquemada, the Inquisition began its terrible work. It was a machine designed to produce guilt. It operated in secret, its tribunals relying on anonymous denunciations. The accused were not told the names of their accusers. They were presumed guilty, and confessions were extracted through sleep deprivation, psychological torment, and horrific physical torture. Those found guilty of Judaizing were forced to undergo public humiliation in ceremonies known as autos de fe, or acts of faith. The unrepentant were relaxed to the secular arm, a chilling euphemism for being handed over to be burned at the stake. The Inquisition created a climate of pervasive fear, a world of whispers and denunciations that would stifle Spanish intellectual life for centuries. It was the Trastamara blood obsession writ large, a national autoimmune disease where the body politic attacked its own most dynamic cells. With the kingdom being pacified internally and its soul being purified by the fires of the Inquisition, the monarchs turned to the final piece of their grand project, the conquest of the Kingdom of Granada. The small Muslim emirate in the south was the last remnant of Al-Andalus, the last piece of the peninsula not under Christian rule. For Isabella and Ferdinand, the completion of the Reconquista was a sacred duty, a divine mission that would cement their legacy and prove God's favor for their new Spain. In 1482, they launched the Granada War. It was a 10-year epic, a crusade that became the defining venture of their generation. It was a war that served multiple purposes. It channeled the restless, violent energies of the newly tamed nobility, giving them a holy war to fight for the crown instead of a civil war to fight against it. It was also a laboratory for a new kind of warfare, one where modern siege artillery played a decisive role, its cannon systematically reducing the ancient Moorish fortresses to rubble. Isabella and Ferdinand were not distant monarchs. They were warrior sovereigns, living in campaign tents for months on end. Ferdinand commanded the armies, while Isabella, the quartermaster general of the crusade, organized the vast logistical effort required to keep the war machine moving. On January 2, 1492, their quest reached its triumphant conclusion. Before the gates of the city of Granada, Boabdil, the last Nasrid Sultan, surrendered the keys to the Alhambra Palace. The red and gold banner of Castile and Aragon was raised over the highest tower of the city. After nearly 800 years, the Reconquista was over. It was a moment of profound, almost apocalyptic significance for the Spanish consciousness, the fulfillment of a destiny centuries in the making. That year, 1492, became the pivotal year of their reign, a year of triumph so absolute it seemed to bend the arc of history. But the victory was immediately followed by two decisions that laid bare the uncompromising, intolerant nature of the new Spain they had created. In March, they signed the Alhambra Decree, giving all remaining Jews in Spain an ultimatum: convert to Catholicism or leave the kingdom forever. It was a final brutal act of purification. An entire culture which had enriched Spain for a millennium was expunged. Tens of thousands were forced into exile, a diaspora of talent and capital that Spain would never fully recover. The second decision of 1492 was a gamble. For years, a persistent Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus had been trying to convince them to finance a reckless voyage to reach the East by sailing west. In the euphoric triumphalist atmosphere following the fall of Granada, Isabella agreed. It was a small investment, a shot in the dark. But when Columbus returned, he brought with him news that would dwarf even the conquest of Granada. He had not reached the Indies, but a new world. This accidental discovery would, within a generation, turn the Trastamara monarchy into the center of the world's first global empire, funded by a seemingly endless river of American gold and silver. They had reached the apex. They had united a kingdom, conquered a crusade, purified a faith, and launched an empire. Now they turned to the final and most crucial task: securing this magnificent legacy for their bloodline. Their foreign policy was their dynastic policy. They had 5 children, 1 son and 4 daughters, and they would use them as strategic assets in a grand chess game to ensure the long-term security and prosperity of Spain. The goal was to build a cage of alliances around their great rival, France. This was the Trastamara strategy of absorbing rival bloodlines, now projected onto the map of Europe. Their youngest daughter, Catherine of Aragon, was betrothed to Arthur, the heir to the English throne. Their eldest daughter, Isabella, was married to the heir of Portugal, a union designed to finally bring about a peaceful unification of the peninsula. But the centerpiece of their strategy, the keystone of their entire dynastic arch, was a spectacular double marriage alliance with the most powerful rising house in Europe, the Habsburgs of the Holy Roman Empire. This was a pact of immense strategic importance. The Habsburgs controlled vast territories in Central Europe, and crucially, the wealthy and prosperous Burgundian lands of the Low Countries. An alliance with them would completely encircle France. And so the deal was struck. Their only son and heir, Prince John, the hope of Spain, was married to the Habsburg princess, Margaret of Austria. And in a reciprocal union, their second daughter, Juana, was sent to Flanders to marry the Habsburg heir, Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy. This was the moment where the Trastamara legacy was sealed and delivered to the future. It was the genetic nexus. The blood of Isabella and Ferdinand, already highly concentrated through generations of cousin marriages, was now to be formally merged with the blood of the Habsburgs, another dynasty that practiced extensive inbreeding to keep its vast scattered territories within the family. 2 parallel obsessions, the Trastamara obsession with the purity of its blood and the Habsburg obsession with the unity of its lands, were about to fuse. The result would be a new dynasty, the House of Habsburg, which would inherit the Spanish Empire and the Trastamara throne. And it would also inherit the concentrated, amplified, and ultimately catastrophic genetic frailties that had been accumulating for a century within the Trastamara line. The vessel for this fateful genetic transfer was the Infanta Juana. She was a woman who seemed to embody the Trastamara inheritance in its most volatile form. She had her mother's piety and her family's intelligence, but she was also possessed of a deep emotional fragility, a tendency towards melancholy and obsession that had been noted since her youth. This sensitive, passionate young woman was plucked from the austere, rigid, and intensely religious court of her parents and dropped into the glittering, sophisticated, and morally lax court of Burgundy. It was a profound culture shock. And there she met her husband, Philip the Handsome. He was everything a Renaissance prince was supposed to be: athletic, charming, and breathtakingly beautiful. And Juana fell for him with a terrifying, all-consuming passion. It was not just love, it was an obsession, a complete surrender of her own identity to his. And for Philip, a casual, faithless philanderer, this suffocating devotion was first a novelty, then a burden, and finally an irritation to be treated with cruelty and contempt. Juana's love, unreciprocated and betrayed, began to curdle into a tormenting public jealousy. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. She threw herself into fits of rage, refused to eat, and would spend days locked in her rooms. The whispers started first in the Burgundian court and then echoing back to Spain. The Infanta was unstable. She was difficult. She was mad. The Trastamara curse, the hidden flaw in the blood that had manifested as weakness in John II and impotence in Henry IV, was now resurfacing in Juana as a sickness of the mind. And then, just as this new, fraught dynastic chapter was beginning, fate intervened with a series of blows so brutal it seemed the heavens themselves had turned against the house of Trastamara. The future that Isabella and Ferdinand had so meticulously planned, the great dynastic fortress they had built to protect their legacy, began to crumble stone by stone. The curse of their blood was about to claim its price. For a dynasty, there is no crueler irony than to achieve absolute power only to find you have no one to leave it to. At the dawn of the 16th century, Isabella and Ferdinand stood at the apex of the world. They commanded a united Spain, a nascent global empire, and a fearsome military machine. They had built a dynastic fortress of marriage alliances designed to secure their legacy for all time. And then they watched as fate, with a series of swift, brutal blows, dismantled it piece by piece. The Trastamara curse, the flaw hidden deep within their carefully guarded blood, had been patient. Now it came to claim its due. The first stone to fall from their great fortress was the keystone itself. In 1497, their only son, Prince John, the hope of Spain, the boy who had been groomed since birth to inherit their vast domains, fell ill with a fever and died. He was 19 years old and had been married for only 6 months. The grief that struck the court was absolute, a black wave of despair. Queen Isabella, it was said, was never the same again. A part of her light was extinguished forever. With John's death, the direct male line of the Trastamara dynasty, the line they had fought so hard to establish and purify, was gone. The succession, once a straight and certain path, now twisted into a series of desperate, tragic detours. The crown passed, in theory, to their eldest daughter, Isabella, the Queen of Portugal. For a fleeting moment, it seemed a new, even grander destiny was possible, a peaceful, personal union of the entire Iberian Peninsula. But tragedy struck again. A year later, in 1498, this Isabella also died, in childbirth. She left behind an infant son, Miguel de Paz, the Prince of Peace. For 2 years, this tiny child was the heir to Castile, Aragon, and Portugal, the living embodiment of a united Iberia. The hopes of 3 kingdoms rested on his fragile life. And then in 1500 he too died. The dream of a peaceful union vanished. The curse had struck twice. Now there was only one path left. The succession fell upon the next daughter in line, Juana. Juana, the emotionally fragile infanta in the glittering, decadent court of Burgundy. Juana, the woman already gaining a reputation for her wild jealousy and erratic behavior. Juana, the wife of the ambitious, handsome, and utterly untrustworthy Philip of Habsburg. The entire magnificent inheritance of the Catholic monarchs, a united Spain, a growing empire in the Americas, the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, was now destined to pass to a woman whose grip on reality was visibly fraying, and through her, to a foreign prince who saw Spain not as a sacred trust, but as a prize to be seized. For Ferdinand and Isabella, it was a waking nightmare. They received increasingly disturbing reports from Flanders about their daughter's state of mind. Her obsessive love for Philip had become a public spectacle. She would fly into rages if he so much as glanced at another woman. She allegedly attacked one of his supposed mistresses with a pair of scissors. Philip, for his part, treated her with a mixture of contempt and political calculation. He saw her mental fragility not as a tragedy to be managed with compassion, but as a political opportunity. If his wife could be proven insane, then he, as her husband, could claim the regency of Castile and rule in her name. The Trastamara blood, so carefully hoarded and concentrated, had produced an heiress whose own mind was becoming the battlefield for the future of her kingdom. In 1504, the great Queen Isabella lay on her deathbed. Her final years had been consumed by grief and a gnawing anxiety for the future. Her will was a testament to this turmoil. She affirmed unequivocally that her daughter Juana was the rightful queen and proprietor of Castile, but she also included a crucial fateful clause. If Juana should be unwilling or unable to rule, then her father Ferdinand was to serve as regent until Juana's eldest son, a young boy named Charles, who was being raised in Flanders, came of age. It was a desperate attempt to keep control of Castile in Spanish hands, to hold back the tide of the Habsburg succession. It was a clause that guaranteed conflict. Isabella's death was the signal for the final act to begin. Philip the Handsome could barely contain his glee. He now styled himself King Philip I of Castile and prepared to sail to Spain with Juana to claim their kingdom. Ferdinand, grieving and politically isolated, tried to hold on to power, citing his wife's will. But the great nobles of Castile, the men whose fathers and grandfathers had been tamed by the iron will of Isabella, now saw their chance. They resented Ferdinand, the stern Aragonese king, and they flocked to the banner of the young, charismatic, and reputedly generous Philip. They hoped for a return to the good old days of a weak monarch and a powerful aristocracy. In the spring of 1506, Philip and Juana landed in Spain. What followed was not a war, but a political capitulation. Ferdinand, seeing that the nobility had completely abandoned him, was forced to concede. He met with his son-in-law and signed a treaty agreeing to retreat to his own kingdom of Aragon and leave the governance of Castile to Philip. In a final cynical act, both men signed a second secret treaty, agreeing that Juana was mentally incapable of ruling and that she should be excluded from power, effectively imprisoning her within her own court. Philip had won. He was the undisputed master of Castile. His triumph, however, was astonishingly brief. For 5 months he reigned as king, delighting the Castilian court with his charm and lavishing rewards on his supporters. And then in September of 1506, after a vigorous game of pelota in the city of Burgos, the hot and thirsty king drank a large quantity of iced water. He was seized by a violent fever. Within a week, Philip the Handsome, the man who had outmaneuvered the great Ferdinand and won the throne of Castile, was dead at the age of 28. The suddenness of his death shocked the kingdom. Rumors of poison inevitably flew, with many pointing the finger at Ferdinand. But the truth was likely more mundane, a case of typhoid or another virulent fever. For his wife Juana, however, the cause did not matter. The center of her universe, the object of her obsessive love and tormenting jealousy was gone. And with his death, her already fragile mind completely and irrevocably shattered. This was the moment that the legend of Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, was born. She refused to allow her husband's body to be buried. She had his corpse embalmed, dressed in magnificent robes, and placed in a lead-lined coffin. And then she began a journey. For 8 months, the queen, heavily pregnant with her 6th child, led a macabre funeral procession that wandered aimlessly across the frozen plains of Castile. The coffin traveled with her, and at every stop she would have it opened so that she could gaze upon the decaying face of her handsome prince. She forbade any women, especially nuns, from approaching the coffin, her pathological jealousy continuing even after his death. It was a spectacle of grief so profound, so bizarre, so utterly unhinged, that it confirmed to all of Spain that their queen was truly, hopelessly insane. This was the ultimate tragic fruition of the Trastamara curse. The dynasty's obsession with its own blood, its generations of inbreeding, had culminated in a queen whose mind had collapsed into a black hole of grief and madness, a queen who was now leading a phantom court of the dead across her own bewildered kingdom. The chaos gave Ferdinand the opportunity he needed. With the country leaderless and on the brink of anarchy, he returned to Castile, not as a rival, but as a savior. There was no one left to oppose him. He gently but firmly took control of his mad daughter. The grim procession ended, and Juana, the rightful queen of Castile, was taken to the royal palace in the small, isolated town of Tordesillas. There she was confined, and there she would remain for the next 46 years. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was and would always be the legitimate queen. All official documents were signed in her name first, but she was a queen who held no power, saw no one, and slowly faded from memory, a living ghost haunting the heart of the Spanish Empire. Her madness, whether a genuine psychosis rooted in her genetic inheritance or a profound depression exacerbated by unimaginable grief and political manipulation, had served its purpose. It had removed her from the board, allowing her father and then her son to rule in her name. The Trastamara strategy of dealing with inconvenient female claimants, imprisonment, and isolation had come full circle, now used by a father against his own daughter. Ferdinand ruled as regent of Castile until his death in 1516. In his final years, he completed the family's work, conquering the southern part of the Kingdom of Navarre and adding it to the Spanish crown. When he died, the magnificent, terrifying, and tragic legacy he and Isabella had built passed to one person, the eldest son of the Mad Queen in her tower at Tordesillas, a 17-year-old boy living in Flanders, a boy named Charles. When Charles of Ghent arrived in Spain in 1517, he was a foreigner in his own kingdom. He was a Habsburg. He spoke no Spanish, only French and Flemish. His court was filled with his Burgundian friends and advisors, who looked upon the stern, proud Spaniards with disdain and saw Spain as a treasure chest to be looted. His accession was not easy. He faced a major revolt from the Castilian cities, who resented this foreign king and his greedy courtiers. But he was the king. He was the undisputed heir of the Trastamara bloodline. And when people looked at him, they could see the physical manifestation of that long, tangled history. He possessed the distinctive protruding lower jaw and chin that would become the infamous trademark of his family, the Habsburg jaw. It was a visible, undeniable sign of the generations of inbreeding that had led to his reign, a genetic trait passed down and amplified through the cousin marriages of his Trastamara ancestors, and now cemented in his own Habsburg features. He was the living embodiment of the dynasty that had preceded him. He would become the most powerful man in the world. As Charles the Martyr of Spain, and later as Charles the Holy Roman Emperor, he would rule over an empire that stretched from Vienna to Peru, an empire on which the sun never set. He inherited the unified Spain, the disciplined armies, the centralized bureaucracy, and the river of American gold that Isabella and Ferdinand had bequeathed to him. The Trastamaras had built the vessel of empire, and now a Habsburg was at the helm. And so the story of the House of Trastamara comes to its end. It is a story of breathtaking achievement and profound self-inflicted tragedy. It is the story of a dynasty born from the sin of fratricide, a house forever haunted by a sense of its own illegitimacy. This insecurity drove them to an obsession with their own blood, a belief that by turning inward, by marrying cousin to cousin, they could purify their line and secure their throne. For 100 years, this strategy seemed to work. It consolidated their power, united two kingdoms, and culminated in the glorious reign of the Catholic monarchs. But they could not escape the consequences. The same strategy that brought them to the pinnacle of power contained the seeds of their own destruction. The blood they sought to purify carried a hidden flaw, a predisposition to instability and madness that, amplified by generations of inbreeding, finally consumed their last heir, Queen Juana. They left their magnificent, world-spanning empire to a new dynasty, the Habsburgs. But they left them more than just an empire. They left them their blood, and with it, their curse. The Habsburgs would inherit the Spanish throne, and they would continue the Trastamara tradition of marrying within the family, leading to an even more catastrophic genetic decline that would end, a century and a half later, in the tragic, sterile, and grotesquely deformed figure of the last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II. The Trastamaras, in the end, were a bridge built of ambition, faith, and blood. They led Spain out of the chaos of the Middle Ages and into the dawn of the modern era. But it was a bridge that was destined to collapse under the weight of its own flawed design, leaving behind a legacy of imperial glory and a haunting lesson in the inescapable tragedies of blood.